back when they were in the Woodman of the World Hall, Daddy would talk about how they had a goblet and a plate, and the sacrament was served, the bread was served on the plate, and the water was in the goblet, and the goblet was big enough that everybody could have a sip of water by turning it around, and nobody overlapped. And so that kind of gives you an idea of the size of the group.
When I was about 12, I guess, it was just before the war. And Hugh B. Brown at the time was the liaison with the military for the church. And he came and spoke because we were getting more and more service people in. And his talk, I don't remember what he said, but it made me decide to go ahead and join the church.
The earliest thing that I can remember is going to church, and I think this was in 1946 or maybe possibly 45. When Mom and Dad got married, Mom went inactive for a short time, and then she felt the need, I guess, for us to get back into the church. And I remember the very first Sunday that we went, we arrived a little bit late, and I think that might have been because Mom was a little embarrassed about having been inactive for a while. And we arrived, and the sacrament was being passed. So we just sat on the steps there on Bailey Street at the First Ward and waited for sacrament to be passed, and then we went in. The only problem is that we didn't just slip in and slip out. The members were so friendly and happy to see somebody new that they immediately talked to Mom, and you know, we just have been super active ever since then.
He sat down with my wife and I and thanked me for that I was going to be released as the branch president, and that they were going to create a new ward. And so of course I was kind of brokenhearted about that, the fact that I was being released. But then he told me that the Lord had called me to be the bishop of that ward. So then I was called and sustained that same day to be the bishop of the ward, and he ordained me a high priest and then ordained me a bishop of the ward. So I was the first Hispanic bishop in San Antonio.
My grandfather, who lived in Salt Lake, called me and offered congratulations, and I asked him for what? He said, well, I see you're the new state clerk in the Corpus Christi state. I said, well, that's great. That's news to me. So nobody had ever talked to me about that. And we weren't obviously at the state conference where it took place because we were in Utah. So
they usually used to publish those details in the church news.
Yeah, so he read it in the church news, I guess is where he picked it up.
We would travel up to the farm, which is somewhere between Corpus Christi and San Antonio, and spend the day working on weeding the rows of peanuts or harvesting or whatever particular assignment was given to us. And they seemed to be long days. We had the kind of fun that teenage boys will have when you're out working, trying to get out of doing as much work as possible. But we did do our share of labor, I guess. And I remember at the end of the day, it was always great because they would blow a whistle, and we knew that was the time that we could change into our swimming trunks and go jump into the stock pond.
Casey said, well, we've got state conference coming up in 3 months. If you can get you a stake and get the people. Well, we didn't have enough people in Austin to farm that stake, so we had to recruit. So, and he gave us, to his credit, he gave us time, and I don't think he thought we could do it in 3 months.
Every ward and branch in the church has its own pioneers, and I think that it's great for us to remember them. And I think it's great that I think that when Pioneer Day is coming around, I think they ought to honor all the different pioneers in every one of the stakes that are in the wards that are around. I think that's great. The other night in our meeting at the Stake Center, we had a meeting, and they were talking about the progress that the church was making and so forth, and they had listed the men that had done this and done that. But even with all this, telling them what Dad had done, very little is ever said about what Mom has done. And she consequently, in my opinion, was certainly equal to what Dad accomplished and what he was able to do. And I think we ought to be more mindful of our spouses and what they do.
About 2 years ago, when Katrina hit, some of us from the church, I met them at Leon Springs, and we drove down to Kelly Air Force Base on the other side of town. And inside this Kelly Air Force Base, they had brought people. People had come from the coast. There we helped them, we served them, we gave them towels and wash rags, we gave them hygiene kits from the church. We gave them beds. We would direct them to a place where they could all sleep with their children. And one man asked me, I told him to have these 6 beds, and he said, couldn't I have these that my children could be closer to me? I said, yes, you can. And the people were so thoughtful. They all said thank you for whatever we gave them or whatever we did for them. It was really remarkable. And it was a place where they were fed and they could bathe and dress. They could get clothes. Whatever they needed, we could help them there. I went, it was 2 days, and it was wonderful. I didn't go back because it strained my feet on the cement floor all those hours every day.
He had been very faithful in keeping his food storage. And when he got the notice that Houston was to be evacuated, he had a large pickup truck and he filled it with everything that he could take that was of food storage. Now the traffic was very heavy coming from Houston. As a matter of fact, the eastbound lanes from San Antonio were closed so that all 4 or 6 lanes, as the case may be, could be used for the refugees coming from Houston. As he made the trip from Houston, which was a very slow process, he met people who were off to the side of the road. They needed water. Some of them had not eaten, and so he gave them his food storage. And when he had made a number of stops, eventually arrived in San Antonio, he had expended nearly all of his food storage.
Those are the kind of things that make a big impact on people, is that you're willing to, you're willing to open your homes and to feed people that need to be fed and things like that. And just like I said, when we have disasters, to go in and pitch in and help people and stuff. It's, not only, the members of the church, just walk into a neighborhood and see what you can do for anybody.
The church sends extraordinary amounts of aid, whether it be food, clothing, all types of aid all around the world, but they don't publicize it. We were not aware of it until we served in the storehouse and had firsthand knowledge of what was taking place. But the church doesn't publicize it. They keep it, it's very quiet, but they help. They're usually on the scene almost before anybody else is.
Yeah.
And so they are very instrumental in helping people who are in horrible disasters, and they're there right on the spot.
Sometimes as members we take for granted things that we should not take for granted. And everyone thinks, well, I'll get to my family history when I'm older. I'll get to it when I'm retired, or I'll get to it when my children are grown. But these people, the non-members that come in, they're just on fire with wanting to know about their ancestry. And all I can think is they're just blessed with the spirit of Elijah.
Yeah, that's all they want to talk about is what they found, or, you know, they order the films, and sometimes they look at that film and they don't get anything off of it. And then the next time they'll look at another film and they find all kind of information, and they just want to tell you everything that they found. They're so excited about it.
And we were teaching this man who was an immigrant from Mexico, and he worked on one of the dairies up there. And we would visit him a couple times a week and try and teach him. And this one opportunity I had to share my testimony with him, and then to share the story of my grandfather. And I just remember that he was really touched by that, and really, I think it helped him to realize how special it was of an opportunity that he had to listen to the gospel and to bring it into his life.
He set an example for us to follow in the sense of giving to the church and spreading forth the gospel, but also being able to realize that, you know, he sacrificed so we can have these blessings. And so anything that we do from then on, we can look back and say, you know, great-grandpa Jose Pedraza did this so we could have this. We wouldn't have a temple if people like him and Jose Pedraza, Henry Turley, and the Shaws hadn't sacrificed becoming members of the kingdom, so we could have a temple here and then receive those blessings to go along with it, to be having a temple.
When I think of the temple, I think of Joe's dad, because Joe's dad worked so much for the temple, taking people to the temple who would never have been able to go. His mom and dad helped different people, and there were people who really gave up everything to be able to go to the temple in Mesa. And I think about them and how the work that they did trying to help these people go to the temple, and I think about how wonderful they would think it was. And what a blessing it has been.
I remember making a request to our stake that if we really wanted to have a temple come to this area, that we could do it, but we'd need to express those wishes. And one night at a stake leadership meeting, we had a 12-year-old deacon give the closing prayer. And in his prayer, he specifically stated that we as Latter-day Saints would love to have a temple come to be given or come to the San Antonio area. And I remember sitting on the stand that night, and I was profoundly touched by this young 12-year-old boy. Maybe, you know, it was reminiscent of a young man, Joseph Smith, that went into a grove of trees at a very similar age, asking that he might be given further light and knowledge, and which of all the churches were true, which should he join. Well, that prayer touched my heart, and I knew at that time that it truly was a sincere desire on the hearts of the people, that they felt that and they desired that very strongly.
I happened to have a ticket that we printed up for the municipal auditorium, and I pulled the ticket out and I handed it over to President Hinckley, and I said, President, I thought you might like to have one of these. And President Hinckley said, what is that? And I said, well, it's a ticket for the municipal auditorium. And President Hinckley, only in his wonderful and delightful way, looked at me with a twinkle in his eye, and he slid it into his pocket, and he said, I better make sure I can get in.
I wasn't that far away from him, actually, and to be in his presence was pretty amazing. I mean, I can't even imagine if you're, you know, if you were in the Savior's presence, if you were in his, so it was, to know that he actually exists. I mean, I know he exists, but, you know, to know that he would come all the way out here just for the dedication of the temple and Jubilee was good.
And I told him, and I looked him in the eye, and I says, President Hinckley, you may not know it, but I want you to know that you're in the most beautiful spiritual temple in the church. And he grinned. He said, "Yeah, you Texans are all alike." He laughed about that. But when it was all over and the last session was finished and he was changing, he used the president's office, and I was in there with him alone, and he told me that's when he told me we really overdid it in this one. We're going to back off a little bit on the others. But he says this is a beautiful temple, and I want you to keep it beautiful.
I'm a very emotional person when I bear my testimony, and I've prayed and asked my Father to help me not to be too emotional, but it's still I sing a hymn and I get emotional. But I remember at the dedication, while he was speaking, his wife had passed away. When a few months before, and his voice broke about how he remembered his wife. So I knew that man loved his wife, and like I love my wife, and it was a very spiritual thing to be able to hear something like that.
Pretty soon after the session started and I was taking my numbers down from the units that were calling in, here comes Casey, and he's in tears. And evidently the brother that had been in talking to me must have been President Hinckley's secretary or assistant, and he went and told him that the second stake president was in the building. So at the beginning of the last session, President Hinckley said,
well, what he said was, he said, I saw the Bremer girls down the hall and I spoke to them. And he said, I understand that President Golightly's in the building. He said, President Golightly, where are you? I said, I'm right here. I was standing in the hallway. And he said, come here a minute. I walked over to him. He put his arm around me and he said, how old are you? And I said, I'm 81. He said, well, you're just a kid. And then we got into this conversation about, it was just a very short conversation. And he talked to me for a little bit. And he said, the first thing he said is that, what have they done? Demoted you to an usher? And I said, no, they promoted me to an usher. And then we batted back and forth a little bit, and then I was gone. But boy, he was as strong as a horse. He was just really grabbing a hold of me and holding tight.
And Brother Coburn, who was the temple department man in charge of the whole thing, came in and he says, that never happens. They never leave the script. They never do that. But they had, but I missed the whole thing.